My daughter-in-law went crazy when I refused to give her the money from my ranch sale. Learn to share. You're going to die soon anyway, she snapped. My eldest son grabbed her arm and then delivered a punch that broke my nose. 10 minutes later, I made them regret they were ever born. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story to the end. And comment from which city you are watching me. That way I can see how far my story has reached. At 63 years old, I never thought my own son would make me bleed at my own dining room table. But there I was, with blood dripping onto the tablecloth my mother had embroidered, feeling my nose throb with pain. The cartilage had fractured with a sound that still echoed in my ears. It all started that Sunday afternoon when I announced my decision during family dinner. I had been putting off this conversation for weeks, knowing it wouldn't be easy, but I couldn't postpone it any longer. The ranch that my late husband, Edward, and I had built over 40 years of marriage needed to be sold. The medical bills, the maintenance, the constant repairs. Everything had become too much for a woman my age. Robert, my 38-year-old eldest son, was sitting to my right, cutting his steak with precise mechanical movements. His wife, Kimberly, a 35-year-old woman with dyed blonde hair and perfectly manicured nails, pecked at her salad while checking her phone. It was the same scene as always, the two of them acting as if my house were a restaurant and I were the waitress. "I've made a big decision," I said, placing my fork on the plate. My voice sounded firmer than I felt inside. "I'm going to sell the ranch." The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Robert looked up from his plate. His blue eyes, the same ones he had inherited from his father, narrowed slightly. Kimberly stopped chewing, her expression transforming from boredom to sharp interest. "Sell the ranch?" "Why didn't you discuss this with us first?" Robert asked, his voice controlled, but with a hint of something I couldn't immediately identify. "Because it's my decision," I answered, trying to keep calm. "I've been struggling with the expenses for months. The property taxes have gone up. I need a new roof, and the irrigation system is failing again." Kimberly straightened up in her chair, her green eyes shining with an intensity that put me on edge. I had seen that look before, whenever anything related to money came up in our conversations. "Well," she said, letting her fork click metallically against the plate. "I guess it's for the best. How much do you expect to get for it?" The question caught me off guard, not because of what she asked, but because of the tone. There was no concern for my well-being. There was no sadness for losing the family home, just numbers, just money. "The realtor estimates we could get around $800,000, I said carefully. "With that, I can buy a smaller house in the town and have enough to live comfortably for my remaining years." Kimberly practically lit up. She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured hands lacing together on the table as if she were about to close a business deal. "That's wonderful, Olivia," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Robert and I have been talking about expanding our construction business. With an investment like that, we could double our income in less than 2 years." I felt as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped on me. "Excuse me?" Robert nodded, as if the conversation had already been decided without my input. "It makes sense, Mum. We understand investments and business. You would simply keep the money in the bank, earning practically nothing in interest." "That money is for my retirement," I said, feeling my voice harden. "For my new house, for my medical bills, for my security." Kimberly let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, please, Olivia. Let's be realistic here." She leaned back in her chair, studying me as if I were a problem that needed solving. "Learn to share. You're going to die soon anyway." The words dropped onto the table like stones thrown into a calm pond. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt as if all the oxygen molecules had been sucked out of the room. "What did you just say?" I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. Kimberly shrugged with an indifference that chilled my blood. I'm being practical. You're 63 years old, Olivia. How many good years do you have left? 10? 15 if you're lucky. We're young. We have a whole life ahead of us. We can make that money grow, create something lasting. Robert said nothing to stop her. He didn't protest. He didn't apologize for his wife. He simply nodded, as if Kimberly's words were the most sensible logic in the world. That money is mine, I said, my voice gaining strength. I earned it alongside your father over 40 years of hard work. Every dollar represents sacrifices you cannot even imagine. Sacrifices that we can now honor by multiplying that investment, Robert retorted. Mum, think about it rationally. I stood up so abruptly that my chair wobbled backward. No. The answer is no. That money is to secure my future, not to finance your business dreams. Kimberly stood up too, her face contorted in an expression of pure fury. You're a selfish old woman, after everything we've done for you. Everything you've done for me? I repeated, incredulous. Like what? Coming to dinner once a week and complaining about the food? Asking to borrow money that you never pay back? Ignoring my calls when I need help with something? Robert stood up slowly, his face adopting that cold expression that painfully reminded me of his father when he was truly angry. But there was something different, something darker in his eyes. Calm down, Mom, he said, his voice dangerously low. You're being dramatic. I'm not being dramatic, I replied, feeling years of pent-up frustrations begin to overflow. I'm being clear. My money, my decision. Kimberly took a step toward me, her eyes burning with a rage that scared me. Listen to me, old woman. That money belongs to us as much as it belongs to you. We are family. Family doesn't talk about the death of their loved ones as if it were a financial convenience, I snapped at her. That was when Robert completely lost control. I saw him lunging toward me, his face twisted in anger. But my mind refused to process what was happening until it was too late. His hand connected with my face, and the pain was so intense and sudden that for a moment everything went white. I fell backward, my hand instinctively covering my face as I felt warm blood seeping between my fingers. The pain was sharp, throbbing, but what hurt the most was the realization of what had just happened. My own son, the baby I had carried for 9 months, the child I had fed and cared for, the man I had raised to be better than this, had hurt me. When I could finally focus my vision, I saw them standing there. Robert, with an expression of shock mixed with defiance, and Kimberly with something akin to satisfaction. Look what you made me do, Robert muttered. But there was no remorse in his voice, only cold justification. I slowly got up, wiping the blood from my face with the cloth napkin. I could feel my nose already beginning to swell, and when I breathed, the air whistled through what was clearly damaged cartilage. But instead of the fear or devastation they probably expected to see, something entirely different settled in my chest. A strange, almost supernatural calm took hold of me. I looked up at them, my blood staining the white napkin, and I smiled. 10 minutes, I said softly, my voice strangely serene despite the injury. In 10 minutes, you are going to deeply regret this. I saw them exchange a confused glance, but I was already walking toward my home office, leaving a trail of blood drops on the hardwood floor that Edward had installed with his own hands decades ago. They were right about one thing. I was old. But what they didn't know was that age comes with wisdom, patience, and the kind of revenge that only someone who has lived long enough to understand exactly how the world works can plan. Their arrogance had just given me the perfect gift, the moral justification I had been waiting for years. As I cleaned the blood from my face in the bathroom mirror, I couldn't stop my mind from going back to the last 5 years. ever since Robert had married Kimberly. There had been signs, so many signs, that I had chosen to ignore because I wanted to believe that my son was still the kind-hearted boy I had raised. The first time I noticed something strange was during their honeymoon. They had gone to Europe for 3 weeks, a trip that cost more than $15,000. When they returned, Robert called me from the airport. "Mum, we need you to pick us up. Kimberly isn't feeling well, and we don't want to spend money on a taxi." I drove 45 minutes to the international airport, only to find them waiting with 12 suitcases and an attitude that surprised me. Kimberly barely greeted me, too busy complaining about the flight, the plane food, everything. Robert didn't seem the same either. There was a new coldness in him, a way of looking at me as if I were a nuisance. On the way home, Kimberly began to talk about their plans. "We need a bigger house," she said, looking out the window as if the scenery bored her. "We can't live in that apartment forever. We're thinking of something at least 4 bedrooms, with a pool." "That sounds wonderful," I replied, trying to keep the conversation friendly. "Have you been saving a lot?" Robert and Kimberly exchanged a glance in the rear-view mirror. It was a look I didn't understand then, but that I now recognized as complicity. "Well," Robert said slowly, "we were hoping that maybe you could help us with the down payment." My heart sank a little, but I tried to keep my voice neutral. "How much do you need?" $60,000, Kimberly answered without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to ask someone for that amount. I nearly slammed on the brakes. $60,000 was a fortune to me, representing years of careful savings. "That's a lot of money," I murmured. "Oh, come on, Olivia," Kimberly said, turning to look directly at me. "It's not like you need it for anything urgent. It's just sitting there in your savings account." The casualness with which she spoke about my money disconcerted me, as if my savings were a family account to which everyone was entitled. "I need to think about it," I finally said. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Robert said nothing to support me or to diffuse the tension. He just looked ahead, as if the conversation wasn't about him. That night, after dropping them off at their apartment, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, trying to understand what had changed. My son had returned from his honeymoon like a different person, or maybe he had simply stopped pretending to be who I thought he was. The loans started shortly after. First, it was $500 for car repairs, then $1,000 for Kimberly's unexpected medical bills, then $2,000 for an investment opportunity they couldn't pass up. Each time they promised to pay me back, and each time I was naive enough to believe them. I never saw a single cent back, but it wasn't just the money. It was the way they started treating me. Sunday visits became obligations they endured, not family moments they enjoyed. Kimberly arrived with a list of complaints. The food was too salty, the house was too hot, my television was too old and small. "Aren't you ashamed to live like this?" she asked me once, looking around my living room as if it were a contaminated place. "A woman your age should have better standards." Robert just laughed, as if his wife's insults toward his mother were entertainment. The breaking point should have been the incident on Edward's birthday. Every year, on the anniversary of my husband's death, I prepared his favorite meal and put fresh flowers next to his photograph. It was my way of honoring his memory, something sacred to me. That day, in particular, Robert and Kimberly arrived without warning. They found the table set with Edward's photo and the flowers, and Kimberly openly scoffed. "This is disturbing, Olivia. The man is dead. You need to get over it and move on." She picked up Edward's photograph and turned it face down. "It's sickening to maintain these kinds of rituals." I waited for Robert to say something, to defend his father's memory, to defend me. Instead, he nodded. "Mum, Kimberly is right. This is too much. Dad's been gone for 5 years. I felt as if I had been slapped. Not only was she disrespecting Edward, but Robert was allowing his wife to dictate how I should process my grief. That night I dialed the number of my sister, Carla, who lived in California. I needed to talk to someone who understood. "Carla," I told her, my voice breaking. "I think I'm losing Robert." "What do you mean?" I told her about Kimberly, about the loans, about how they treated my house like a cheap hotel, and me like I was service staff. Carla sighed deeply. "Olivia, have you considered that maybe Robert was always like this? What if Kimberly didn't change him, but simply gave him permission to show who he truly was?" Her words haunted me for weeks. I began to remember things from Robert's childhood that I had overlooked or justified. His tendency to blame others when something went wrong, the way he manipulated situations to get what he wanted. Like Edward, when he was alive, he often told me that I was being too permissive with him. "You're raising him to think the world owes him something," Edward had warned me more than once. "One day that's going to come back to bite you." But I had ignored those warnings, believing that my unconditional love would turn him into a better man. Last year, things worsened dramatically. Loans became demands, visits became inspections. Robert and Kimberly began to make comments about how irresponsible it was for a woman my age to live alone on such a large property. "It's dangerous," Kimberly insisted. "What if you fall? What if you have an accident? No one would know for days." "You should consider moving to a senior living community," Robert added. "You'd be safer, you'd have company." At first I thought they were worried about my well-being, until I realized that every conversation about my safety ended with suggestions about what to do with the ranch. "You could rent it out," Kimberly suggested. "Or better yet, sell it to us. We'd take better care of you than any nursing home." The idea of selling them my home, the place where Edward and I had built an entire life together, horrified me. But they insisted, week after week, until their suggestions began to sound more like orders. 3 months ago, I decided to install a new security system, not because I feared external intruders, but because I had started to suspect that Robert had keys to my house and was entering when I wasn't home. Small things had been out of place. Papers moved, drawers I remembered closing appeared ajar. The system included discrete cameras in the main areas. What I discovered broke my heart. Robert and Kimberly had been coming regularly when I was out shopping or at my doctor's appointments. Not only were they going through my things, but they were also recording videos of themselves mocking my house, my belongings, me. In one of the videos, Kimberly held up one of my favorite dresses, laughing. "Look at this," she was telling Robert. "Can you believe someone wears something so hideous? When we move in here, we're going to have to burn all these old lady clothes." "When we move in here," Robert repeated, looking at the camera he didn't know was recording. "I hope we don't have to wait much longer. She's taking too long to realize she can't live alone anymore." My blood ran cold. They weren't just waiting for me to move out. They were planning to take over my house. In another video, I saw them checking my bank statements that I kept on my desk. Kimberly took pictures with her phone, while Robert calculated numbers on his calculator. "With what she has in savings, plus the value of the house, we're talking about more than $1 million, Robert said. "If we convince her to sell the house to us for half its value, we could have everything settled." "What if she refuses?" Kimberly asked. Robert shrugged. "Then we would have to be more creative. A woman her age living alone. Accidents happen." Those words chilled me to the bone. My own son was talking about accidents as if it were a viable option. But the worst of all came last week. I installed an app on my phone that allowed me to access the cameras remotely, and one afternoon, while I was at the grocery store, I received a motion alert. Robert and Kimberly were in my house again, But this time they had company. A man I didn't recognize was with them, checking the structure of the roof beams and the electrical installations. If something were to happen to the old woman, I heard Kimberly say, how long would it take for someone to notice? The stranger, who was apparently some kind of contractor, replied, depending on when it happens, we could have several days, maybe a week, before someone came looking for her. Robert nodded, taking notes. And how hard would it be to make it look like a natural accident, electrical or structural? Whatever is more believable, the man asked. I had to hold on to the shopping cart to keep from fainting. My son and his wife were literally planning my death. That night, after they left, I sat in my kitchen trembling, not from fear, but from a cold, calculating anger that I didn't know I possessed. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. I started planning. I knew I needed help, but I had to be careful. I couldn't involve the police without solid evidence, and Robert was skilled at manipulating situations to his advantage. Instead, I contacted my lawyer, Thomas Miller, with whom Edward and I had worked for years. Thomas, I told him during our private meeting, I need to make some changes to my will, and I need to know exactly what my legal options are if someone is planning to harm me. Thomas looked at me over his glasses. Olivia, is everything all right? No, I answered honestly, but it's going to be. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas and I worked on a plan that would protect me and ensure that Robert and Kimberly could never benefit from their cruelty. But I needed the perfect moment to execute it. I needed them to reveal their true intentions in a way they couldn't deny. Tonight's dinner had been that opportunity. Their violence, their disregard for my life, their demands for the ranch money. Everything had been recorded by the cameras they didn't know existed. As I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, my nose swollen and my eyes already beginning to bruise, I smiled for the first time in months. Robert and Kimberly had been playing a game they thought only they knew. What they didn't know was that I had been playing a completely different one, and I had just won. It was time to collect. I returned to the dining room with a clean towel pressed against my nose, walking slowly to create maximum tension. Robert and Kimberly were exactly where I had left them, but something had changed in their body language. Robert was pacing nervously near the window, while Kimberly had sat down again, but her fingers were drumming impatiently on the table. "Are you done with your drama?" Kimberly asked when she saw me enter. Her voice had a hint of anxiety that she tried to disguise with sarcasm. I sat down slowly in my chair, carefully placing the blood-stained towel on the table, right where both of them could clearly see it. It was a silent reminder of what had just happened. "You know," I said, my voice surprisingly calm, "for the last 5 years, I've been wondering if I really knew you. If the son I raised and the woman he chose were the people they pretended to be when they came to visit me." Robert stopped by the window. "Mom, you're being overly dramatic about this." "Dramatic?" I repeated, gently touching my swollen nose. "Do you think this is dramatic, Robert? Because for me, this is clarity." Kimberly leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Clarity about what?" I smiled, and I could see how that smile made them uncomfortable. It was not the smile of a victim. It was the smile of someone who finally had all the cards in her hands. "Clarity about who you really are," I said, slowly standing up. "About what you've been planning, about what you really think of me." I walked toward the china cabinet where I kept my crystal glasses, the same ones Edward had given me on our 20th anniversary. I picked one up and held it to the light, as if examining its purity. "For example," I continued without looking directly at them, "now I know that you've been entering my house when I'm not here, that you've been checking my bank statements, that you've been taking photographs of my financial documents." The silence that followed was so heavy that I could practically feel it pressing against my chest. When I finally turned to look at them, Robert's face was pale, and Kimberly had stopped fiddling with her nails. "We don't know what you're talking about," Robert muttered, but his voice sounded hollow, unconvincing. "No?" I asked, tilting my head. "Don't you know about the man you brought last week either? The one who was checking my electrical installations and the roof beams?" Kimberly stood up so abruptly that her chair wobbled. "You're a paranoid old woman. No one has been in your house." "Kimberly," I said softly, "do you remember what you told that man about how long it would take for someone to notice if something happened to me?" The transformation on her face was instantaneous. The color drained from her cheeks, and for the first time since I had known her, Kimberly looked genuinely scared. Robert took a step toward me, his expression hardening. "Have you been spying on us?" "In my own house," I replied calmly. "Imagine that." "This is ridiculous," Kimberly burst out, but her voice cracked slightly. "You have no idea what you're saying." I walked toward my home office knowing that they would follow me. And they did, like puppies following their owner, except that in this case they were more like wolves following a prey who had just revealed her own fangs. My office was my sanctuary. The walls were covered with family photographs, diplomas, and memories of 40 years of marriage. But it was also where I kept my computer and where I had been planning my revenge for the last 2 weeks. I sat down in front of the computer and turned it on slowly. Robert and Kimberly stood behind me, and I could feel their anxiety radiating like heat from their bodies. "Do you know what the funny thing about modern technology is?" I asked as I waited for the machine to boot up. "One can install security cameras so small that they are practically invisible, and they can record for weeks without anyone noticing." "Mom," Robert said, and for the first time in years, his voice sounded like the little boy he had been, scared, vulnerable. "What are you doing?" "I'm showing you who you really are," I replied, clicking on a folder labeled Evidence. The screen filled with a list of video files, organized by dates. There were dozens of them. I selected one from last month and double-clicked. The image that appeared was crystal clear. There were Robert and Kimberly in my living room, laughing as they went through my drawers. The audio quality was perfect too. "Can you believe she keeps this old stuff?" Kimberly's voice came out clearly from the speakers. On screen, she was holding one of my family photo albums. "When we move in here, all this goes straight to the trash." "When we move in here," Robert's recorded voice repeated. "I hope we don't have to wait much longer." I paused the video and turned to look at them. Kimberly had a hand over her mouth, and Robert looked as if he was going to throw up. "This was from the 15th of October, I said conversationally. "Would you like to see the one from the 22nd of October? That one is particularly interesting. It's when you discussed the different ways to make my death look accidental." "Olivia," Kimberly whispered. "Can I explain?" "Explain what?" I asked, selecting another file. "Explain why my son and his wife have been planning to kill me to take my money. Please, I'm anxious to hear that explanation." I clicked on the second video. This time, the images showed Robert, Kimberly, and the unknown contractor discussing faulty electrical installations and structural accidents. "If something were to happen to the old woman," Kimberly's recorded voice said, "how long would it take for someone to notice?" Robert slumped into a nearby chair, burying his head in his hands. "Mum, we never were actually going to do anything." "No?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Then why did you hire a specialist to discuss specific methods? Why did you take photographs of my bank statements? Why have you been lying about your finances to get more loans?" Kimberly found her voice, although it sounded shrill and desperate. "Those videos were taken without our consent. They are illegal." I laughed. a genuine laugh that startled them. Kimberly, dear, these are recordings from my own house, on my private property. Not only are they completely legal, but they clearly document your conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. We never said we were going to kill you, Robert shouted, raising his head. His eyes were red, either from tears or panic. No, you're right, I admitted, clicking on a third file. You never used that specific word. You preferred terms like accident, structural problem, and my personal favorite, permanent solution. The third video began to play. This time it showed a conversation they had had just the week before, where they discussed how much money they could get if they sold the ranch immediately after I was no longer a problem. We could have everything liquidated in 6 months, Robert's voice said in the recording. With the money from her bank accounts, plus the sale of the property, we'd be talking about more than $1,200,000. And nobody would suspect anything, Kimberly added. A woman her age, living alone, these accidents happen all the time. I stopped the video and turned to them again. Robert was visibly trembling, and Kimberly looked as if she was calculating her escape options. Now, I said, my voice taking a more serious tone, we come to the interesting part of our conversation. I stood up and walked toward my safe, a small unit Edward had installed years ago. I dialed the combination slowly, savoring every second of suspense it created. You see, I continued as I opened the safe, over the last 2 weeks I've been very busy, not only installing security cameras, but also consulting with attorneys, private investigators, and some other very interesting professionals. I pulled a thick folder from the safe and placed it on my desk. This folder contains copies of all the videos you just saw, along with some others that I haven't shown you yet. It also contains a complete analysis of your personal finances, which turned out to be quite revealing. Robert and Kimberly exchanged a look of pure panic. For example, I continued, opening the folder, I discovered that your successful construction business actually owes more than $200,000 in commercial loans, that you have been lying on your tax returns for the last 3 years, and that Kimberly has been using credit cards under false names. Kimberly stumbled backward, as if I had physically slapped her. That's not true, I finished for her. Oh, but it is. I have documents that prove everything. I pulled out another set of papers from the folder. I also have here a sworn statement signed by the contractor you brought to my house. It turns out that Roberto Sanchez has a criminal record for insurance fraud, and when my private investigator explained the possible legal consequences of conspiring to commit murder, he became very cooperative. Robert stood up abruptly, his face twisted in desperation. Mom, please, we can explain all this. We can fix things. Fix things? I repeated, my voice dripping incredulity. Robert, 10 minutes ago you broke my nose because I refused to give you my money. A week ago you were planning my death. Exactly what part of this do you think can be fixed? Kimberly had started to cry, but they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of panic, of someone who had just realized she had completely lost control of the situation. Please, she sobbed. We didn't know what we were saying. We were stressed about money. We weren't thinking clearly. Oh, but you were thinking clearly, I replied, pulling the last document from the folder. You thought clearly enough to research my life insurance policies, to find out exactly how much my properties were worth, to meticulously plan how to access my bank accounts after my death. I held the document toward them. This is a complete report of your online activity for the last 6 months. Every searchable item, every website you visited about common domestic accidents in the elderly, every forum you participated in discussing methods to make a murder look like natural death. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, even my own breathing. But from Robert and Kimberly, there was no sound. They were completely paralyzed by shock. "Now," I finally said, placing the document back in the folder, "we are going to discuss exactly what is going to happen next." I sat down in my chair, crossed my hands on the desk, and looked them straight in the eye. "But first, I think you should know something very important about the ranch you covet so much." I smiled, and this time there was nothing maternal or benevolent in that smile. It turns out it was never really mine to sell. The expression on Robert and Kimberly's faces when I uttered those words was like watching two balloons deflate simultaneously. Confusion replaced panic, and then confusion gave way to something akin to terror. "What do you mean it was never yours?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying every second of their bewilderment. "Sit down," I ordered. "This is going to be a long conversation, and you'll want to be comfortable for what's coming." Kimberly slumped into the nearest chair, her hands visibly trembling. Robert remained standing, but he clung to the back of a chair as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "When your father and I bought this ranch 42 years ago," I began, "we didn't buy it the traditional way. Edward was very smart with money, much more than either of you ever bothered to find out." I pulled another document from my safe, this one yellowed with age but perfectly legible. "This ranch was bought under an irrevocable family trust. Do you know what that means?" I saw them exchange blank looks, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of disgust. They had been planning to steal a property about which they knew absolutely nothing. "It means," I continued, "that technically I was never the owner of this property. I am the primary beneficiary of the trust, with the right to live here and use the land for my entire life. But the actual property belongs to the trust." "And what does that mean for us?" Kimberly asked, her voice raspy. "For you, absolutely nothing," I replied coldly, "because you are not beneficiaries of the trust." Robert finally sat down, his face pale as paper. "Who are the beneficiaries?" I smiled, and it was the most genuine smile I had had in years. "Your children, Robert, Daniel, and Sophia." The silence that followed was so deep that I could have heard a feather drop. Robert and Kimberly stared at me as if I had started speaking an alien language. "That's impossible," Kimberly stammered. "We haven't seen those children in over 2 years." "Precisely," I said, my voice hardening. "You haven't seen them because you decided it was more important to please a new wife than to maintain a relationship with your own children." The story of Daniel and Sophia was painful for me and devastating for them. When Robert married Kimberly, she had made it very clear that she didn't want baggage from his previous marriage. The children, who were then 12 and 14, were gradually excluded from Robert's life. First, it was the cancelled visits, I recalled out loud. Then the ignored phone calls. Then, when Sarah, your ex-wife, moved to Colorado with the children, you simply let them go. "That's not true," Robert protested weakly. "Things were complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated. "Robert, you didn't go to Daniel's 8th grade graduation. You missed Sophia's piano recital. When Daniel broke his arm playing baseball, you didn't even know until 3 weeks later." Kimberly had started to get nervous, her eyes darting between Robert and me as if she was calculating something. "That was Sarah's decision," she insisted. "She turned them against us." "Sarah called me," I said quietly. "Every time you cancelled a visit, every time you ignored a call from the children, she would cry, wondering what she had done wrong, why their father had abandoned them so completely." Tears began to run down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from an anger that had been simmering for years. "And I lied to her," I continued. "I told her I was sure Robert loved them, that he was just going through a difficult time. But the truth was, I knew exactly what had happened. You had chosen Kimberly over your own children. Robert tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand to silence him. 3 years ago, I continued, when I realized that the two of you were more interested in my money than in a real relationship with me, I started to wonder about my true grandchildren, so I contacted Sarah. I pulled out my phone and searched through my photos until I found what I was looking for. I showed them to Robert and Kimberly. A recent photo of two beautiful teenagers smiling next to a woman who had aged gracefully. Daniel is 17 now, I said. He's the captain of his school's debate team and wants to study law. Sophia is 15. She's first violinist in the Colorado Youth Orchestra and wants to be a veterinarian. Robert looked at the photo as if I had shown him ghosts. They are incredible children, I continued. Smart, kind, hard-working, everything you could have been if you hadn't chosen the easy path at every opportunity. Why are you telling us this? Kimberly asked, although I think she already knew the answer. Because for the last 2 years I have been in constant contact with them, I replied. I have visited them 5 times in Colorado. They have come here 3 times when you were out of town. We have built the relationship that their father destroyed. Robert looked like he was going to faint. You've been seeing my children without telling me. Your children, I repeated disdainfully. When was the last time you talked to either of them, Robert? Do you remember their birthdays? Do you know what grade they are in? He didn't answer, because he couldn't. He didn't know anything about his own children. Daniel turned 17 last month, I said. I gave him his grandfather Edward's watch, the one you assumed you would one day inherit. Sophia took first place in a state violin competition 2 weeks ago. I sent her flowers and took her out to dinner when she came to visit me. I walked toward my desk and pulled out another folder, this one labeled Family Trust. Edward established this trust not only to protect the property, I explained, but to ensure that it passed to future generations who truly valued family. He wrote a very specific clause about the conditions under which beneficiaries could be changed. I opened the folder and read directly from the document. In the event that any direct heir demonstrates disregard for family values, abandons their own children, or shows violence toward the trust administrators, their rights shall be automatically transferred to the next generation. Robert finally understood where this was going. Mum, you can't do that. It's already done, I replied simply. Your aggression tonight was the final qualifying event. The lawyers have been notified, and the paperwork is being processed right now. I pulled out my phone again and dialed a number. They answered after the second ring. Mr. Miller, this is Olivia. Yes, it just happened. They have everything recorded. Perfect. Proceed with the documents we discussed. I hung up and smiled at Robert and Kimberly. In 48 hours, I said, Daniel and Sophia will officially be the heirs to this ranch. They will also be the beneficiaries of my life insurance, my savings accounts, and everything else you thought you could steal. Kimberly stood up so abruptly that she knocked over her chair. This is insane. Those kids don't even really know you. They know me better than you have ever known me, I retorted. Daniel helped me install the security cameras the last time he was here. Sophia was the one who suggested I hire a private investigator when I told her about your unauthorized visits. The revelation hit them like a slap. Not only had I been in contact with the grandchildren they had abandoned, but we had been working together to protect me from them. In fact, I continued, enjoying every moment of their shock, it was Daniel and Sophia who convinced me to document everything before confronting you. They wanted to ensure there was irrefutable evidence of who you really are. Robert stood up, staggering slightly. Where are they now? In a safe place, I replied, waiting for my call to confirm that everything went according to plan. I dialed another number on my phone, this time activating the speaker so they could hear. "Grandma," came the clear voice of a young man from the phone. "Are you okay?" "I'm perfect, Daniel," I answered, without taking my eyes off Robert. "Everything went exactly as we predicted." "Did Uncle Robert really hurt you?" asked another voice, feminine and worried. "Sophia. He fractured my nose," I confirmed. "But don't worry. The lawyers already have all the evidence they need." "Dad," Daniel said, and for the first time in the conversation, he addressed Robert directly. "Can you hear me?" Robert was paralyzed, looking at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "We want you to know," Daniel's voice continued, "that Grandma told us everything you've been planning. About the videos. About the man you brought to plan her accident." "It's disgusting," Sophia added, her voice trembling with emotion. "How could you even think about harming Grandma?" Kimberly snatched the phone from my hands. "You don't understand anything. You're just children. Your father loves you." "If he loved us," Daniel replied with a calmness that painfully reminded me of Edward, "he wouldn't have abandoned us years ago. And if he loved Grandma, he wouldn't be planning to kill her for money." "Besides," Sophia added, "we're not children anymore. We're old enough to understand exactly what kind of people you are." Kimberly dropped the phone as if it had burned her. "Daniel, Sophia," I said, picking up the phone, "why don't you tell your father about the surprise we've been planning?" "Oh, yes," Daniel said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Dad, we hope you don't have plans for next weekend." "Why?" Robert murmured. "Why?" Sophia replied with barely contained delight. "We're moving to the ranch permanently. Grandma is legally adopting us as her heirs, and Mum already signed the papers so we can live here during our college years." "Also," Daniel added, "I've already submitted my application to the University of Texas. I'm going to study law, specifically family and elder law. My first case is going to be ensuring that people like you can never take advantage of vulnerable seniors." Robert collapsed into his chair, all the fight draining out of him. "See you Friday, Grandma," the children said in unison. "We love you." "I love you too," I replied, and these were the first completely honest words I had said all night. I hung up the phone and looked at Robert and Kimberly, who looked like two castaways contemplating a ship sailing away without them. "Now," I said, sitting back down at my desk, "let's talk about what's going to happen to you." The silence in my office was so dense that you could cut it with a knife. Robert and Kimberly had become completely motionless, like salt statues, processing the magnitude of what had just been revealed to them. Not only had they lost any possibility of inheriting my money, but they had been outsmarted by the very grandchildren they had abandoned years ago. I slowly got up from my chair and walked toward the window that overlooked the backyard. Edward had planted those rose bushes for our 10th anniversary, and every spring they continued to bloom, beautiful and resilient, despite the winter frosts and summer droughts. "You know," I said, without turning toward them, "for the last 5 years I have constantly wondered if I had failed as a mother, if I had somehow raised a son capable of planning his own mother's murder for money." I heard Robert shift uncomfortably in his chair. "But after the last few weeks, watching you, documenting your every action, talking to Daniel and Sophia about what they remembered from their childhood, I finally understood something." I turned to face them directly. "I didn't fail as a mother, Robert. I failed as a judge of character. I gave you too many chances. I made too many excuses. I ignored too many warning signs." Robert finally found his voice, although it sounded hoarse and desperate. "Mom, we can still fix this. We can go to family therapy. We can." "Family therapy," I repeated, touching my swollen nose. "Robert, less than an hour ago you fractured my nose at my own dining room table. A week ago, you were consulting with a criminal about the best way to make my death look accidental. There is no therapy in the world that can fix that." Kimberly had remained silent since the phone call with the grandchildren, but now she stood up abruptly, her face contorted in fury. "This is ridiculous," she screamed. "Those spoiled brats are going to destroy everything we've worked for." "What you've worked for?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Kimberly, your only job for the last 5 years has been to manipulate my son into abandoning his responsibilities and planning ways to steal my money. That's not work. That's parasitism." Her eyes filled with tears, but not of sadness. It was pure rage. "You have no right," she shrieked. "Robert is your son. I'm your daughter-in-law. Those kids are strangers to you." "Those strangers," I replied coldly. "They called me every Sunday for the last 2 years. They sent me handwritten cards for my birthday. Daniel helped me fix the garden fence the last time he was here, and Sophia taught me how to use new apps on my phone." I walked toward my desk and pulled out a final folder. This one marked legal consequences. "While you," I continued, "only contacted me when you needed money, never remembered important dates, and spent the last 6 months planning my death." I opened the folder and placed several documents on the desk. "Now, let's talk about your immediate future," I said, my voice taking a completely professional tone. "First document, a restraining order that goes into effect tomorrow morning. You cannot come within 500 yards of this property, me or Daniel and Sophia." Robert stood up so abruptly that he knocked over his chair. "You can't do that." "It's already done," I replied. Second document, a civil lawsuit for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and trespassing. The damages requested total $2 million. Kimberly staggered backward as if I had hit her physically. Third document, I continued relentlessly. Copies of all the evidence we have collected being sent to the Internal Revenue Service, documenting your fraudulent tax returns and the use of false identities to obtain credit. "Mom, please," Robert pleaded, and for the first time in years he sounded genuinely desperate. "We can pay back the money we owe you. We can—" "Fourth document," I interrupted him. "A letter to all your current construction clients informing them of the pending criminal charges and recommending they seek alternative services." I pulled out my phone and showed a list of numbers. "I have already spoken with 3 of your largest clients. Curiously, none are comfortable employing someone who plans to murder their family members for money." Kimberly collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically. But even through her tears, I could see that it was not remorse that motivated her. It was pure self-pity. Robert took a step toward me, his hands outstretched as if to beg. "Mom, we're family. There has to be a way to resolve this without destroying our lives." "Family?" I repeated, the words sounding bitter in my mouth. "Robert, when you were planning my death, were you thinking of family? When you took photographs of my bank statements without my permission, were you thinking of family? When you hit me in the face an hour ago, was that a family act?" He didn't answer because he couldn't. "Family," I continued, "is Daniel and Sophia, who call me to tell me about their school days. Family is Sarah, who sends me photos of the kids during their sports competitions. Family is the people who care about your well-being without expecting anything in return." I walked toward the office door, clearly indicating that the conversation was over. "You," I said, turning to look at them one last time, "are criminals who share my DNA. That is all." Robert made one last desperate attempt. "What if we promise to change? What if we move away and never bother you again?" I laughed, a short, humorless laugh. "Robert, 5 years ago when you started borrowing money from me, you promised to pay it back. 3 years ago when you cancelled Daniel and Sophia's Christmas visit, you promised to make it up to them. 6 months ago, when I asked you directly if you had been in my house without permission, you promised you would never do such a thing. I approached him until we were face to face. Your promises are worthless, I said in a low voice, and I am no longer interested in hearing them. The front doorbell rang and I smiled. Perfect. That must be Officer Martinez. I called him after you hit me to report the assault and file formal charges. Robert paled to the colour of the wall. Also, I added casually, I hired a private security service that will be patrolling the property 24 hours a day until Daniel and Sophia move in here permanently. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. I suggest you cooperate fully with Officer Martinez, I said, walking toward the front door. Resisting will only make things worse for you. I opened the door to find Officer Martinez, a middle-aged man I had spoken with on the phone. Behind him was another younger officer. Mrs. Miller, Officer Martinez said, removing his hat. We received your call about a domestic assault. Yes, I replied, carefully touching my swollen nose. My son hit me when I refused to give him money. Everything is documented on video. His eyes hardened. Violence against seniors was something the local police took very seriously. Where are the perpetrators now? In my office, I replied, guiding them inside. I also have extensive evidence of their conspiracy to plan my death and steal my property. As we walked down the hallway, I heard desperate voices coming from the office. Robert and Kimberly were arguing in furious whispers, probably trying to coordinate their stories. When we entered the office, both stood up immediately. Robert tried to force a smile, but it faded when he saw the serious expression of the officers. Officers, he said, trying to sound casual. Is there some misunderstanding? Robert Miller, Officer Martinez interrupted. You are under arrest for aggravated assault against an elder. You have the right to remain silent. While Officer Martinez read Robert his Miranda rights, the younger officer approached Kimberly. Ma'am, we also need to speak with you about charges of conspiracy and trespassing. Kimberly started sobbing again, but this time there was real panic in her tears. This is unfair, she shouted as Robert was handcuffed. She set us up. Ma'am, Officer Martinez said with professional calm, recording criminal activity on your own property does not constitute a setup. It constitutes evidence. As the officers escorted Robert and Kimberly toward the door, Robert turned to me one last time. Mum, he said, his eyes desperate. Please, don't do this. I looked at him for a long moment, memorizing his face. My son, the baby I had held in my arms, the child I had raised to be better than this. Robert, I said softly, you already did this. I am just documenting the consequences. I watched them leave from my window, Robert in the back of one patrol car, Kimberly in another. Their cars would remain in my driveway until someone came to pick them up, silent reminders of the night I finally got my life back. When the red and blue lights disappeared in the distance, I pulled out my phone and dialed a familiar number. Daniel, it's Grandma. Yes, it's all over. Your father and Kimberly are arrested. No, I'm fine. A little bruised, but fine. Can you put Sophia on? Grandma, came my granddaughter's worried voice. Do you need us to come tonight? No, sweetheart, I replied, feeling the tension finally leave my shoulders. But pack your things. Your new home is waiting for you. I hung up the phone and stood in the silence of my house. For the first time in years, it was truly mine again. And for the first time in years, I actually had a family. 6 months later, I woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. For a moment, I lay in bed, listening to the voices of Daniel and Sophia as they prepared breakfast, animatedly discussing some television show they had watched the night before. It was a sound I never thought I would hear in this house again, the sound of a real family. I slowly got up, my bones protesting slightly. At 63, mornings weren't as easy as they used to be, and I put on my favorite robe, the one Edward had given me on our last anniversary. When I went downstairs, the aroma of bacon and pancakes filled the air. Sophia was standing in front of the stove, her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing one of my aprons that was too big for her. Daniel was sitting at the table, a laptop open in front of him as he reviewed what looked like college applications. "Good morning, Grandma," they said in unison when they saw me enter, and my heart filled with a warmth I had forgotten existed. "Good morning, my loves," I replied, kissing each of them on the forehead. "How did you sleep?" "Ah, better than ever," Sophia replied, flipping a pancake with the skill of someone who had been perfecting the technique for months. "Although I think I heard the neighbours' horses again last night." "Probably," I said, pouring myself a cup of the coffee Daniel had made. He had inherited Edward's talent for making the perfect cup of coffee. "The Morrisons have 3 new horses. They're trying to get them used to the area." Daniel looked up from his laptop, smiling. "I heard back from the University of Texas yesterday." My heart skipped a beat. Daniel had been working tirelessly on his college applications, determined to study law as he had promised that night, 6 months ago. "And?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. His smile widened into a full grin. "Accepted, with a full merit scholarship." Sophia screamed with joy, momentarily abandoning the pancakes to hug her brother. I remained motionless for a moment, processing the news, before tears began to run down my cheeks. "Oh, Daniel," I murmured, joining the group hug. "I am so proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma," he said, his voice slightly choked with emotion. "Without this place, without your support, neither of us would be where we are now." It was true. The last 6 months had been transformative for all of us. After years of being ignored by their father, Daniel and Sophia had flourished in an environment where they were valued and supported. Their grades had improved dramatically, their confidence had grown, and most importantly, they had begun to heal from the wounds that Robert had caused with his abandonment. "What about you, Sophia?" I asked, serving myself a plate of pancakes. "How are the auditions for the regional youth orchestra going?" Sophia's eyes lit up. "The audition is next week, but my violin teacher says I have a really good chance. And if I get in, there's a summer tour to Europe." "You'll go," I said confidently, "and I'll be in the front row at your first concert." We sat down to eat breakfast together, something we did every morning since they had moved in permanently. It was a simple routine, but it meant everything to me. For years I had eaten alone at this table, remembering the days when Edward sat across from me, planning our day or sharing stories from his work. Now the table was full of life again. "Grandma," Daniel said after a moment, his tone becoming more serious. "We heard news about Dad yesterday." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. We had talked very little about Robert over the last few months, focusing instead on building our new life together. "What kind of news?" I asked carefully. "Mom called us," Sophia replied. Sarah had been wonderfully cooperative throughout the transition, even expressing relief that her children finally had a stable parental figure in their lives, even if that figure was their grandmother. Dad pleaded guilty to the charges. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. "And Kimberly?" "Her too," Daniel said. "Apparently their lawyers told them the evidence was too solid to fight. Dad received 2 years in prison and 5 years of probation. Kimberly received 18 months and 3 years of probation. Plus," Sophia added, "they have to pay full restitution for all the loans they never paid back, plus additional damages." I put down my fork and leaned back in my chair, processing the information. Robert would be in prison for the next 2 years. By the time he got out, Daniel would be in his 2nd year of college, and Sophia would be finishing high school. "How do you feel about that?" I asked. Daniel and Sophia exchanged a look, one of those moments of silent communication that only siblings can share. "Sad," Daniel finally replied, "but not surprised, and honestly relieved too." "Yes," Sophia agreed. "It's like we can finally stop waiting for him to change. We don't have to wonder anymore if he's going to call, or if he's going to remember our birthdays, or if he's going to be there when we need him." "Now we know he won't," Daniel continued, "and that's better than living with false hope." The wisdom in their words surprised me. These children, who had been through so much pain and abandonment, had emerged stronger and more perceptive than many adults I knew. "And you are okay with that?" I asked. "We have everything we need," Sophia replied, smiling. "We have a home where we are loved, a grandmother who believes in us, and a future we can build for ourselves." "Besides," Daniel added with a mischievous grin, "when I graduate from law school, my first official case will be making sure Dad and Kimberly comply with every term of their probation." I laughed in spite of myself. "Already planning your legal career?" "Absolutely," he replied. "I specialize in elder law and protection against financial abuse. There are too many people like you who are victimized by their own families. Someone needs to fight for them." My heart swelled with pride. This young man, who had been abandoned by his own father, had channeled that experience into something positive, something that could help others. "You know what?" I said, standing up. "I think it's time to show you something." I led them to my office, the same place where I had confronted Robert and Kimberly 6 months ago. But now, instead of feeling like a battlefield, it felt like a sanctuary. I opened my safe and pulled out 2 envelopes, each marked with their names. "Your grandfather Edward left something for his grandchildren," I said, handing an envelope to each of them. "He had to wait until you were old enough to truly appreciate it." Daniel opened his envelope first, and his eyes widened when he saw the contents. "Grandma, this is a $50,000 trust fund for your college education," I completed. "Edward started saving it the day you were born." Sophia opened hers with trembling hands. "I have one too." "Also $50,000, I confirmed, "for college, or for music school, or for whatever you dream of doing with your life." Both of them stood motionless, looking at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "Dad never told us anything about this," Daniel murmured. "Because I never told him," I admitted. "When I saw how he was treating you, I decided that he didn't deserve to know about the gift that his father had left for his children." "But Grandma," Sophia said, "doesn't this mean that you have been looking after this money all this time, protecting it for us?" "Of course," I replied. "That's what real family is for." The 2 of them launched themselves toward me in a hug that took my breath away. We stayed like that for a long moment, 3 generations united not by obligation or expectation, but by genuine love and mutual respect. That afternoon, while Daniel worked on his college essays and Sophia practiced violin in the living room, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, watching Edward's rose bushes. They had bloomed especially well this year, as if the happiness in the house had nurtured them too. My phone rang, and I saw Carla's name on the screen. "Hello, sister," I answered. "Olivia," Carla said, "I just received your letter about Daniel and college. I'm so happy for you." Over the last few months, I had been keeping Carla updated on our new life. She had been incredibly supportive, even offering to fly from California to testify at the trial if necessary. "Thank you," I said. "It has been healing, Carla. Having these children here, seeing them flourish in an environment where they are loved, it's as if the house has come back to life." "And you?" Carla asked softly. "How are you coping with everything?" It was a good question. The last 6 months had been an emotional roller coaster. There had been moments of pure joy, seeing Daniel and Sophia thrive. But there were also moments of deep sadness, mourning the son I had lost, not to death, but to choice. Some days are difficult, I admitted. I still love Robert, despite everything he did. It still hurts to know he's in prison, but I also feel liberated. Liberated how? Liberated from guilt, I explained. For years I blamed myself for how Robert turned out. I wondered what I had done wrong, how I could have raised him better. But seeing Daniel and Sophia, seeing the kind of people they are despite having been abandoned by him, I realized that Robert's choices were his own, not mine. And now, I continued, looking toward the house where I could hear Sophia's violin music floating through the open window, I have the opportunity to be the grandmother I always wanted to be part of young lives that truly value me. I'm so happy to hear that, Carla said. You deserve to be happy, Olivia. You deserve to be surrounded by people who love you for who you are. After hanging up with Carla, I sat on the porch until the sun began to set. Daniel came out to find me for dinner, and as we walked into the house together, I realized something that filled me with a deep peace. This house, which for years had been a place of loneliness and painful memories, was now full of life again. Not in the way I had imagined. It wasn't my young children running through the halls, but in a way that was equally beautiful. During dinner, Sophia told us about a concert she wanted to organize to raise funds for the local animal shelter. Daniel shared his plans to apply for a summer internship at the district attorney's office, specifically in their Crimes Against Seniors division. As I listened to them planning their futures, I realized that I had done more than just protect myself from Robert and Kimberly. I had created a legacy. Daniel would become the lawyer who would protect others from what I had experienced. Sophia would use her music to bring beauty and joy to the world. And both of them would understand, in a way that Robert had never understood, that real family is about mutual support, not exploitation. That night, after the grandchildren went to sleep, I sat in my favorite chair in the living room with the photo album I had been looking at the day I found the security cameras. But this time, instead of pain, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for Edward, who had the foresight to establish the trust that had protected this land. Gratitude for Sarah, who had raised these wonderful children and had been generous enough to allow them to rebuild their lives with me. Gratitude for Carla, who had been my constant support. And yes, even gratitude for Robert and Kimberly, because their betrayal, as horrible as it was, had been the catalyst that had brought me back to Daniel and Sophia. If they hadn't shown their true colours so vividly, I might have continued to feel guilty about keeping them away from the grandchildren. I might have continued to doubt my instincts about their character. Instead, their own cruelty had made the choice clear and irreversible. As I turned off the lights and headed for bed, I passed Daniel's room. His door was ajar, and I could see the light from his desk lamp as he worked on his college essays. Next door, Sophia's room was quiet, her violin carefully stored in its case next to the window. These children, who had come to me wounded and abandoned, now had a home where they could heal and grow. They had a bright future ahead of them, and I would have the privilege of being a part of it. For the first time in years, I fell asleep with a smile on my face, knowing that when I woke up in the morning, I wouldn't be alone. I would have a real family waiting for me in the kitchen, ready for another day of laughter, dreams, and the kind of love that doesn't come with conditions. The ranch that Robert and Kimberly had coveted so much was now truly a home again, and that, I decided as I drifted off to sleep, was the best revenge of all.